Welcome to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the curator of collections.
So this is part 2 of our conversation with George Monbiot. Usually you can listen to our episodes in any order, but for this one, would strongly recommend going back and listening to part 1 if you haven't already.
Yeah, and it's an amazing sort of deep dive conversation with lots of different touchstones and topics. So well worth understanding what we talked about last time in order to understand what we talk about this time.
Yeah.
It's certainly complex.
It is complex.
Yeah.
And complicated, but I think George does an amazing job of breaking that down.
Yeah. And I'd never really thought about the difference between complexity and complicatedness, but, you know, he articulates it very well.
Yeah, truly does. Enjoy. Yeah, I think that comparison of farm work and ecological disaster feels really interesting and pertinent, you know, that ploughing is destroying the land in that work.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the major gatherings and conferences for sustainable farming, Groundswell, there is a plough upended as a sort of representation of the death of ploughing. Ploughs, of course, have been the symbol of farming for millennia now. You know, the very definition of agriculture is centered on this idea of the Neolithic revolution, the emergence of farming 12,000 years ago. That's partly about the domestication of animals, but it's partly about the emergence of better ways of harming the topsoil in order to scrape it up and grow crops. I think there's a fundamental flaw in there right from the outset, which is the way in which we define farming or our relationship with food production. So the idea of perennial crops reminds me of in Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, which is about Australian Aboriginal cultures and relationships with the land. When British colonial settlers first arrived in Australia, they didn't recognise what the indigenous inhabitants of that land were doing as agriculture. It wasn't farming, so it justified the appropriation of land and the obliteration of those cultural practices. But in some respects, what they were doing in terms of sometimes slash and burn, but other forms of sort of fish farming or particular mechanisms for hunting were not quite traditional hunter-gatherer ways of existence, and they weren't quite agriculture. They're somewhere in a sort of ill-defined space in between that doesn't fit into the categories, and therefore it's overwritten by global food systems and practices. This reminds me a little bit, again, in some of your work, you talk about the Greek Golden Age, George, and you know this sort of harking back to this idyllic pre-industrial world or pre-modern world where everyone's able to live in greater harmony with the environment around them. I think we're constantly striving to get that balance right, but it's sort of bound up in this challenge where we don't see ourselves necessarily sufficiently as part of nature, that sometimes it's just othered. And I think the museum is another perfect example of that. You know, nature plays very little part in our collections. It's all about ways of obliterating or extracting from nature. Nature ends up in other collections. It ends up in natural history collections. Yeah. We have amazing collections about the evolution of wheat and humans' interactions with wheat here in the University of Reading, but they're not in the Museum of English Rural Life. They're in the herbarium up the road, the Percival Wheat Collection. We keep these things separate. You know, this complexity, the need to integrate things is critical here. I wonder whether that thing about Australian Aboriginal cultures brings to mind ideas about borrowing from other cultures or our relationship with other cultures, George. Do you have particular perspectives on that?
Yeah, so thank you for raising that. The idea of sort of not recognising other people's agriculture, or indeed not recognising other people full stop, is really fundamental to the model that we call capitalism. And its sort of foundational myth / text is John Locke's second treatise, where he says, in the beginning, all the world was America. And he doesn't mean all the world was inhabited by large numbers of indigenous people with their fascinating and complicated ways of managing and engaging with the land. Oh, no. He means it's empty. It's there for the taking. It's a terra nullis. It's there for European men of property to stake their claim to. And he says that when such a man mixes his labour with the land, he establishes his rights to it. So you have this image of someone turning up with his spade. I'm a European man of property. I'm going to stick this spade in the ground and I'm going to dig a hole. And he digs a hole and says, right, because I've dug this hole, this land is now mine. And you say, hang on a moment, well, how about all the people who've been digging holes or doing other things on this land for hundreds or thousands of years? Do they count? The fact that they mix their labour with the land, does that give them no rights to that land? And how about all the people who might come along in the future and stick their spade in the ground and dig a hole? Do their rights then override your rights? Oh, no. There's this year zero. There's just this one moment where a particular kind of person who is a man, a rich man, a white man from one of the colonial powers turns up and does this one-off establishment of rights by mixing his labour with the land. But hang on a moment. Men like that, they don't dig holes. They don't actually labour on the land. So how can they establish rights to that land? Because they're mixing the labour that belongs to them with the land. They're mixing the labour of their slaves or their servants with the land. They're the ones digging the holes. They're the ones mixing the labour. And so what John Locke effectively is saying is that you can turn up with your slaves. You can terminate the land rights of everyone else in the past and in the future. And you can establish rights to that land in perpetuity by deploying your slaves on that land. So he's effectively erasing the very lives and existence of indigenous people, erasing all future claims to the land in favour of slave owners. That's how the system worked.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me as well, going back to enclosure and the enclosure protests, you would have these wealthy landowners suddenly just blocking off access to resources that had been shared for possibly centuries before. Of course, when that enclosure happened, whether that was hedges or fences being put up, it wouldn't be the landowner going out and building a fence manually. It would be the landowner getting his own workers to seal off this land that he's now claimed just for himself and for others.
Often the workers who just had their rights to the land terminated. So they'd been reduced to mere labour. As opposed to human beings with a stake in the landscape. And what we have seen is this constant interchange between colonial practice and domestic practice. So you find a new way of alienating resources at home, you export it to the colonies, you find a new way of doing so in the colonies, you import it back home. And you create a sort of universal model of extraction and the termination of other people's rights. That's called capitalism.
So this whole conversation about colonialism and about extractive processes and about land rights brings me back to the origins of this museum. So John Higgs, the first keeper of the museum, had an uncle who was a very prominent British dairy farmer, Clyde Higgs. He was a BBC broadcast journalist at times, so shares some connections with you and your career as well, George. But in a very different field. He's obviously talking about farming at a moment when farming is being industrialized and sort of intensified. And he also buys into this colonial or post-colonial environment, the breaking up of empire. Just prior to that, he buys a farm in the foothills of Kilimanjaro, about 4,000 acres, which is traditionally on the border of Chagaland and Maasai land. It's a farm that's been quite well established. It's been there probably since around 1900. A farm called Simba Farm. And he basically tries to establish a slightly sort of European model of improvement there in the late 1940s into the 1950s. And he sort of rage quits around about the time of Tanzanian independence. But in that process, we get this sort of sense that somehow the same voices and people who are involved in worrying about the future of heritage to do with the history of farming in England, but also involved in decision-making about landscapes in England, are also bound up in sort of formative relationships in new countries in a post-colonial world as well. Clyde Higgs, also during this period, sits on the board of the National Parks Committee in England, at the same time as he's railing about the desecration of land by Maasai herders in what becomes Kenya. We've got these real tensions about landscapes that are inhabited and landscapes that are pristine conservation spaces. And I wonder whether this is a good time for you to maybe introduce us to sparing versus sharing arguments and maybe talk about how that fits with different approaches, both past and present, to conservation practice in relation to the natural world.
Yeah. So you won't be surprised to hear me say it's complicated. There's no doubt that the great majority of the world's wildlife species require ecosystems which are not substantially altered by humans in order to survive. And so that by itself creates a very powerful argument for sparing. And we certainly need to have large areas of land and sea where we don't have extractive, productive uses going on. At the same time, we need to create corridors, islands, habitats within our farmed landscapes which enable wildlife to move through. We also need to ensure that people can sustain their farm economies. And so these militate in favor of sharing. And basically what we need is a mixture of the two. It's not a binary. We have to have some land sparing. We have to have some land sparing. Did I say sparing twice?
Yes,
sparing and sharing. Yes, that does the sharing. And one of the problems with the old conservation model in East Africa is it was an enclosure model. We just throw the people off and create, well, originally they were game reserves. They weren't reserves for the sake of protecting wildlife for its own sake. They were for protecting wildlife in order for Europeans to be able to shoot that wildlife. And the local people were then categorized as poachers if they tried to get back into those reserves or tried to hunt any of the wildlife for themselves, which of course is an idea we imported from Britain, where poachers often were killed, were executed, as E.P. Thompson demonstrates in his book Whigs and Hunters. But then gradually those game reserves were turned into nature reserves, national parks, but with a very similar ethos of total exclusion of local people so that they could be used entirely by Europeans or people of European descent. And that's neither a just nor a sustainable means of protecting nature. Unless there's social justice, there will be no long-term environmental protection. And unless there's environmental justice, there will be no social justice either. So you have to have the two things running alongside each other. But of course, a very interesting aspect to this, and you mentioned the founder of Merle, there were quite a lot of men, principally men, leaving Britain in the early and mid-20th century to set up in East Africa. And often they imported their really catastrophic ideas and perspectives. So one of those was Gerard Wallop, Lord Lymington, later the Earl of Portsmouth, who, when he didn't get his way and failed to turn Britain into a fascist aristocracy before the war, in the early 1950s, he left for Kenya and bought land which previously been owned by the Kikuyu, and then was in some way, but because the records are destroyed, we don't have a full account of that, was involved in the suppression of the Kikuyu's revolt, the so-called Mau Mau revolt, which led to horrendous, effectively fascist tactics used by the British, rounding everyone up, putting them in concentration camps and fortified villages, torture, murder, all the rest of it. So it's another of those interchanges between practice at home and practice abroad, the export of colonial ideas, and in this case, the export effectively, in Gerard Wallop's case, of fascism from one country to another. Really what distinguishes Britain from Germany in the mid-20th century is that Germany brought its colonial genocide and expansionism back to Europe, whereas we practiced ours largely on other continents.
So this makes me think about back in 2023, 1993, I was lucky enough to go out to visit the farm where Clyde Higgs had farmed in Tanzania. And I was also traveling around as part of a wider project, working with different Maasai communities linked to the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford. And some of the conversations that I had at that point were with people living in landscapes that were relatively open and unenclosed. Now, this connects back to some work that you did, I think, in the 1990s when you visited Maasai communities and witnessed certain counties in Kenya being enclosed and the impact that that had on both the environment, but also on the sort of social relations and communities themselves. It is amazing to me, given, as Joe's rightly pointed out, that we've had so many conversations on this podcast so far, and it's only been running for a short period of time, about enclosure and the legacies of enclosure in the British context, historically and right up to present, and still sort of moving forward into the future. We're grappling with those legacies, but it amazes me that in other parts of the world, and even in the UK still, people are still enclosing land and restricting access and doing these things that we know have harmful repercussions tens of years, centuries, potentially even millennia later. How do we get out of that mindset, George? Is there a way in which that can be allied with some of the potential solutions to food security challenges moving forward and sustainability challenges moving forward? Do you have a great solution?
So what I found when I was investigating these issues in East Africa was that with the backing of the World Bank and the UK and US governments, the Kenyan government had instituted what it called group ranching, which was effectively taking ranch land, pastoral land away from the Maasai, the Samburu and other herding peoples in East Africa, well, in Kenya, and what they called regularizing the land, creating title to those pieces of land where particular groups within the community could establish their title. Now, straight away, even on paper, that meant excluding very large numbers of people from that land, particularly women, because this was a very male-dominated process. But the moment that starting gun was fired, given that this was the Daniel Arap Moi government, which was notoriously corrupt, it was effectively a dictatorship, meant that it wasn't just some of the people from the community being excluded, it was all of the people from the community. And I came across direct evidence that several ministers in Daniel Arap Moi's government had put themselves down as the owners of the land when this regularization process was taking place. Some of them had awarded themselves enormous land holdings, like 30,000 acres at a time, excluding the entire community, often of people within their own tribe, and because politics was and to some extent remains very tribal there, they would then shift the blame to other people. I went to one rally where this Kenyan minister, a Maasai minister, was addressing the fellow Maasai, and he says, "Those Kikuyu are coming here and stealing your land. We must fight the Kikuyu because they're taking your land." Now, the day before, I had found his name on the deeds to that very land where he'd awarded himself 30,000 acres of it. And so this sort of classic transference, this scapegoating, don't look at me, look at them, the outsiders, they're the ones, they're the enemy, our traditional tribal enemies, they're the ones. And so it's a very similar process to the sort of fascist scapegoating that we now see across Europe and in the United States. And so that was enclosure in action. And absolutely what we need to do, introduce is a de-enclosure process, enable people to be able to work productively on the land, with the land, not necessarily always through farming. I mean, there's lots of different ways of making a living with the land, and nature-based economies offer new ways forward, but ways which are distributive, which are socially just, which aren't enclosed in an exclusive way for the benefit of one or two people, but allow the whole community, whatever that community may be, and I don't want to define communities in any rigid way at all, but allow everyone who lives in the area to have a share in the wealth of that area.
So just a couple of things to pick up on that hark back to earlier episodes before we thank you, George, for an amazing conversation.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about islands and corridors for landscape recovery. and how these need to happen in farmed environments as well. And you also mentioned oilseed rape. If anyone's interested in those, then one of our earliest episodes, we talked about oilseed rape and integrated pest management, but also environmental recovery across landscapes, not working within sort of farmed bubbles, with Alice Mauchline from here at the University of Reading.
That episode was called The Pest is History, which I think was by far our best episode title, actually.
That's great.
Yeah. We're gonna have to come up with something that speaks to complexity or complicatedness for this one.
We'll workshop it. Yeah.
And also those questions about enclosure come up in lots of episodes, but particularly the conversations that we had with Katrina Navikas, who also spoke to some extent about some of the sort of environmental protests, anti-road protests of the 90s. So lots of things that I think are rooted in the origins of some of the campaigns and work and activism that you yourself have been involved in as well, George. One quick shout out to Guy Shrubsole, who came and did a brilliant gallery tour here at the museum a short while ago, and the amazing work that he's been doing on who owns England. So sort of tracing and tracking ownership, I think, is critical to this. And I wonder whether that might be a nice point for you to have the final word, George, and talk a little bit about that kind of campaign and how that connects through to nature and nature connectivity.
Well, Guy has been doing fantastic work on this, really opened up a whole lot of issues which were effectively sealed from us. And he makes the crucial point that unless we know who owns the land, we can have no democratic engagement with that land. And when things are kept secret from us, when powerful interests are able to hide behind a veil of opacity, then we are excluded in all sorts of different ways. And of course, Guy and others have tied that work in with their Right to Roam campaign, which I think is a really critical campaign. We're constantly hearing, oh, people don't understand anything about the countryside. These bloody townies, they come here and they know nothing. But we're going to keep them out of the countryside and we're not going to allow them to learn anything or engage in any way by denying them a right to roam. There's this weird attitude where it's sort of like we lament people's ignorance, but we insist on keeping people in ignorance. I think a right to roam is really essential as part of a sort of positive sense of nationhood, as part of a re-engagement with nature, which is really important, as part of a democratization of the countryside. You know, while it might be owned by a small number of people, too small a number of people in my view, we should at least have rights. Even if we don't have absolute ownership of much of that land, we have rights in that land. And of course, what ownership is a bundle of rights in that land. And what enclosure has done has been to concentrate those rights into the hands of a few people. Well, I think some of those rights should be released so that the rest of us feel the sense that we belong to the land and the land belongs to us.
There's an interesting relationship here as well between kind of closing the loop of this conversation. You know, we talked at the beginning about this model of the city is corrupt and the countryside is pure and wholesome. And yet at the same time, people are deprived access to that wholesome space. And I suppose really what we're saying here is let's reevaluate that relationship and not look at it in such a clouded view, but also allow more people to, you know, use the countryside and enjoy those spaces.
Yeah, no, I think integration is a really important word here. You know, that we can integrate the rural and the urban experience, that, you know, just because you live in the city doesn't mean you should be excluded from the countryside. Just because you're in the countryside doesn't mean you don't have a stake in the city. You know, this is our country.
Definitely.
Regardless of where we live, regardless of where we come from, regardless of our origins, it's a country that should belong to all of us and where we feel welcome everywhere.
That's an amazing way to wrap this up, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's been lovely to talk to you both. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for joining us, George. Just for anyone, any of our kind of international listeners, where can people follow your work?
Well, I write for The Guardian. I sort of collate all that writing on my website, which is monbiot.com, and I do various other forms of troublemaking in other media.
We'll put some links to those in the show notes.
Great.
But yeah, Thank you so much for your
Brilliant.
time, George. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Lovely
And
to chat with
if
you.
you're coming back Readingward, do let us know.
I would love to. I would love to come back and see you in person.
We would love that.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much,
much.
George.
Take care then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye then. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you for listening to Absolute Units. I'm Joe Vaughan.
And I'm Ollie Douglas.
Absolute Units is made possible through Museums Partnership Reading, our partnership of the Merle with Reading Museum. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time for the first of 2 episodes on the theme of Jane Austen.
Woo!
So this year is the 250th anniversary of Jane Austen's birth. And we've been lucky enough to speak to 2 guests.
First up is Isabel Hughes, who is Associate Director and Head of Curatorial and Public Engagement here at the museum. And second is Professor Paddy Bullard, Head of the Department of English Literature here at the University of Reading and one of the country's leading specialists on Jane Austen.
We'll be back in 2 weeks. See you then.
Bye.